In May of 1998, Kathy O'Dowd was climbing high up on the slopes of Mount Everest when all of a sudden she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. It was the sprawled body of another climber, which was definitely a disturbing sight, but it was also one that O'Dowd, an experienced climber, had encountered many times before. However, when she took a closer look, she quickly realized that this was a much more, I'm just gonna say it, f***ed up situation than anything she had encountered on previous climbs. She assumed this was just another dead body that had been left on Mount Everest, but then, while she was looking at it, this supposed dead body, well, it twitched. It turns out that this climber was not dead, at least not yet, and O'Dowd's team now had to decide if they could or even should attempt to save the climber. O'Dowd knelt down next to the climber and was actually surprised to see that it was not a man, but rather a woman. O'Dowd began to rack her oxygen-deprived brain, trying to decide what to do, and as she did this, this fallen climber at her feet suddenly pleaded to her, quote, "Don't leave me, don't leave me." The almost dead climber repeated this, and O'Dowd told her that she must get up and go consult the rest of her team, but this provided no relief to the dying woman laying on the ground at her feet. In a heart-wrenching, desperate tone, the dying climber asked, "Why are you doing this to me?" Now, this climber was certainly delirious, but she still had enough sense to realize that she was most likely too far gone for O'Dowd's team to save her. The only other words that this climber was able to mutter was, quote, "I'm American." And this actually resonated with O'Dowd because all of a sudden she realized that this dying climber was most likely Francys Arsentiev. And this realization about the identity of the climber made the already extremely disturbing situation even worse, because Francys had been known to be climbing as a team with her husband, Sergei. The two had been totally inseparable, and so now as Francys lay there dying, where the hell was her husband? Where the hell was Sergei? It would turn out that one of the most disturbing yet oddly touching stories in Mount Everest history was unfolding right before O'Dowd's eyes. It would also turn out to be one of the most confusing stories as well, and some parts of it actually remain completely unexplained even to this day. What I've told you so far in this video is only the tip of the iceberg. So without further ado, let's get into the story of mountaineering couple Francys and Sergei Arsentiev. So, I don't recall ever covering a love story on this channel before. And okay, obviously this is much more than just a love story, but the relationship between Francys and Sergei Arsentiev is what makes this story so unique and also so tragic. I have two disclaimers before I get into it here. The first one is that some of these names are a little tough for me. I've tried to get everything right, all the names, there's some Russian stuff, but if I mess that up, then I apologize. And the second disclaimer is that there's definitely some mystery left to this story, and some of the details are a little bit shaky. I always do my best to tell you guys nothing but the truth, and the overall story here is certainly true, but I would just take some of like the finer details, maybe like the exact dates and times, things like that, with a grain of salt. And speaking of salt, this video would not have been possible without Drink Element, who is the sponsor and has been a huge, huge supporter of my channel and has allowed me to reach all of you and hopefully inspire and teach all the lessons that I try to cover in these videos. Folks, for a lot of you, summer is already in full swing, and if it's not, if you live in like Vermont or something where I'm from, it's gonna be here real soon. And with the warmer weather that summer brings, that means you're probably gonna be sweating a lot, whether you're going out and hiking or even just doing yard work, whatever it is. It's hot out, you're probably gonna be sweating. And when you sweat, you need to replace your electrolytes to make sure that you stay hydrated and healthy. And you should do it with Drink Element. Drink Element is the best electrolyte drink mix in the game. It's not even close. And the reason is because, first of all, it tastes amazing. They have so many great flavors. citrus salt, orange salt, grapefruit salt. How about chocolate salt or mango chili, even an unflavored version? They have amazing flavors, and their drink mixes have no sugar, no BS in them like you're gonna find in so many other electrolyte drink mixes. All it has is the electrolytes that you need and a great taste. Drink Element has been growing like crazy. Tons and tons of people are starting to realize how amazing they are, and so what are you waiting for, man? You got to check them out. And what you can do is you can go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. You're going to make a purchase through that link of any drink mix that sounds amazing to you. If you're just starting, I would recommend citrus salt. That's my favorite. Make that drink mix purchase. And when you do that through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. Again, one of the amazing things about Element is just how many different cool flavors they have. You really want to try them all. So one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link at the top of the description. And by the way, if you're an Element insider, you actually now have first access to a new product called Element Sparkling. Element Sparkling is a bold 16-ounce can of sparkling electrolyte water. I can't wait to try that. But anyways, with that said, thank you, Drink Element. And now we're gonna get back to the video. At some point in the mid-90s, Francys Arsentiev, or Fran as her friends often called her, set an extremely ambitious goal for herself. She wanted to become the very first American woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen. This was a very dangerous goal, but if she were to achieve it, she would become a legend in the world of mountaineering pretty much overnight. So she set this goal, and then she had to wait a little bit until 1998. Actually, the spring of 1998, which is when her and her husband Sergei arrived at Everest Base Camp. Now, of course, even just setting a goal like that, let alone actually doing it, is going to take time, preparation, and of course, experience. Now, Fran's goal of climbing Everest without oxygen was no exception to this. In fact, I would argue that the roots of this goal started growing when she was very, very young. Francys Arsentiev was born in 1958 in Honolulu, Hawaii, but her childhood, and her adolescence for that matter, was most definitely not constricted to just the island. Around age 6, her father took her to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and as legend has it, this trip was incredibly formative for the young girl. Eventually, she actually ended up attending boarding school in Switzerland, where I can only imagine that her love for the mountains must have deepened. Eventually, Fran would find herself attending college in Missouri before transferring to the University of Louisville, where she ultimately would end up earning her bachelor's degree. She didn't stop there either. She would go on to earn a master's in business from the International School of Business Management in Phoenix, Arizona, before finally getting back to the mountains in Telluride, Colorado. This is where she sort of settled down, if you will, where she worked as an accountant for an unknown period of time during the 1980s. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really able to find much else about her early life. I do believe that she had a brief marriage in like the late 70s, and she also gave birth to a son named Paul at some point, probably around then, but there isn't really much else that's public about her life prior to the 1990s. However, 1991 is when Fran's legacy would truly be set into motion, you could say. And the reason I guess I say that is because 1991 is the year that she met her future husband, who was named Sergei Arsentiev. I could only find one source that provided details about how Fran and Sergei met, so definitely take this with a grain of salt, but allegedly in 1991, Fran and a boyfriend at the time traveled to Nepal in order to summit a few peaks, and I guess Fran had recently gotten into mountaineering, and at some point on this expedition, she met Sergei. Now, Sergei was not American. Sergei was a native of St. Petersburg, Russia, and by the time that he met Fran, he was already an extremely accomplished mountaineer. In fact, according to one source I found, the year before he met Fran, he had summited Mount Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen, becoming the very first Russian climber to ever do this. He had also earned the nickname Snow Leopard after successfully climbing the 5 highest mountains in the Soviet Union. I mean, this guy clearly was just a total beast. And just in case you don't believe me, those 2 accomplishments, while obviously incredible, were literally just like a snapshot of what Sergei had achieved. He was one of the most well-known and well-respected mountaineers in all of the Soviet Union, and I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I can imagine that Fran was probably pretty enamored with him when she first met him. And this feeling must have been mutual, by the way, because despite the, I don't know, awkwardness, clumsiness of an American and a Russian getting together only like a few years after the end of the Cold War, well, they married only about a year after they met, 1992. They met in 91, they're married in 1992. Fran and Sergei were indisputably a power couple in the world of mountaineering. Now, obviously, Sergei was already so accomplished, but I don't want that to overshadow Fran's skills. She was quite literally climbing up in the world of mountaineering before the 2 met, and then after her and Sergei got together, well, they were basically unstoppable. Shortly after they were married, the couple would go on to climb Mount Elbrus, which is the highest mountain in Russia and in Europe, and they didn't just climb it, by the way. Fran would end up skiing down it, which is insane, and in doing this, she became the very first American woman to accomplish this feat. Ultimately, the couple would end up somewhat settling down back in Colorado, but they were frequently traveling to Russia in order to climb various 20,000 foot peaks. That's around 6,000 meters, I'm pretty sure, by the way. And they even made, this is crazy, they even made the very first ascent of a peak in Russia, which they would later name Peak Goodwill. And they also eventually would climb the highest mountain in the United States, which is Denali, as well. I'm telling you about all of this because I really want to drive home that these were 2 experienced, competent, and accomplished mountaineers. And I can't see how they could have possibly been more prepared for Mount Everest than they were. I mean, come on. Like I said earlier, Sergei had already climbed Everest without oxygen, and given all of her experience, it seems like if anyone was ready to be the first American woman to do this as well, it was obviously Fran. It's reported that she had been dreaming about climbing Everest since the early 80s, well before she met her husband. And then in 1998, well, Fran would finally get her chance. In the spring of that year, when they were both around 40 years old, Fran and Sergei arrived at Everest Base Camp in order to begin preparations for their history-making attempt. If they were successful, not only would Fran have been the very first American woman to summit without oxygen, but my understanding is that the 2 of them would have been the very first husband and wife team to summit together without oxygen. I said right there that this was going to be a history-making attempt. I wasn't joking. I mean, this was going to be a really big deal. And I guess in the weeks leading up to their final climb, Sergei and Fran spent a lot of time mingling with other climbers and became fairly well known around base camp. It just so happens that one of the climbers that interacted with Fran at this time was South African climber Kathy O'Dowd. After all their logistics and physical preparation, everything was complete. On May 17th, 1998, Fran and Sergei set out on their final climb up Everest. They were climbing the north side of the mountain, by the way, and by May 20th, they had actually made it all the way to Camp 6, which was their final camp before reaching the summit of Mount Everest. By the time they reached Camp 6, they were at roughly 27,000 feet or 8,200 meters in elevation, which meant that they had officially entered what is known as the death zone. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, maybe even know more about it than I do. But in case you're not familiar, the death zone is any altitude above 26,000 feet, or I guess about 8,000 meters. At that elevation, there's insufficient oxygen for humans to survive for long periods of time. So essentially, once you enter the death zone, your body just starts dying slowly. Now, these effects can be mitigated by using supplemental oxygen, which is what the vast majority of climbers do, but as we've already established, Fran and Sergei were not doing that. Once they entered the death zone, they were literally on borrowed time, and so on May 20th, they made their final push up to the summit of Mount Everest. Folks, this summit attempt did not go as planned. Fran and Sergei made it to an obstacle known as the first step before they had to turn around and head back to Camp 6 due to their headlamps failing. I don't know why or how this happened, but the very next day, May 21st, they made yet another push for the summit, but this time they only climbed about 100 meters out of camp before turning around again and heading back to Camp 6. And it's unclear to me why they turned around this second time. I know even less than I do about their first time, but either way, this means that they spent an extra 2 nights in the death zone without any supplemental oxygen, and that is a really big deal. Now, they were making these attempts in a window of really good weather for Mount Everest, and on May 22nd, this weather was still good. Because of this, the couple made their third summit push, this time leaving Camp 6 around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it is reported that they were moving incredibly slow out of camp, likely due to just fatigue and, of course, the lack of oxygen. But on this third attempt, Fran and Sergei Arsentiev reached the summit of Mount Everest and, well, they made history. This photo was taken of Fran shortly after they reached the summit of the mountain. Unfortunately, the triumph that you can see all over her face here would not last for very long, because the descent of Mount Everest would prove to be nothing short of a complete and total disaster for Fran and Sergei. In fact, that photo of her at the very top of the mountain would end up being the last photo to ever show Fran alive. So folks, the nitty-gritty details of the next series of events are a bit confusing, even kind of contradicting themselves at times, but from what I've gathered, from what I've researched, here's what happened. The couple had summited Mount Everest very late in the day. Some would even say dangerously late, and while they were nearing the top, they actually encountered a climber from Uzbekistan who reportedly commented on how late they were pushing it. Sergei apparently responded to this concern by telling the climber that he shouldn't worry because the couple had cached a tent, some warmer clothing, and an emergency bottle of oxygen between the first and second step obstacles. This climber from Uzbekistan continued descending, and eventually he actually reached the cache that Sergei was talking about. And the climber was again concerned after reaching the cache because it was apparently much less equipped than Sergei described it as. It supposedly only contained 1 bottle of oxygen, and there was no tent or clothing, I guess. The mystery tent was later found further down the mountain and not where Sergei had said it was. So that was very strange. And perhaps even stranger is that the couple never reached Camp 6 the night after they reached the summit, which means that they spent a third night in the death zone, but this time they did it without extra warm clothing or a tent to protect themselves from the elements. Early the next morning, 5 more climbers from Uzbekistan were making their way up towards the summit of Everest when they encountered Sergei around 27,500 feet, or I guess 8,400 meters in elevation. In hindsight, this was a very disturbing encounter because Sergei was completely alone. His wife was nowhere in sight, and Sergei actually asked the group if they had seen her. The couple had somehow become separated on their way down Everest, and Sergei was under the impression that his wife was actually somewhere up ahead of him. One of the mysteries of this entire story is that we don't really know why or how they got separated. It's been suggested that Fran might have been suffering from snow blindness, and maybe she just kind of like wandered off because she couldn't really see. But as far as I could tell, it's really unknown how the separation between the two of them happened. Sergei and the Uzbekistan climbers parted ways eventually, Sergei going down, the other climbers going up, and Sergei did eventually make it back to Camp 6, again, by himself. I mean, at this point, he must have been completely exhausted, but he was apparently still like perfectly coherent, and, you know, other than just being tired, he was healthy. And it seems as though he almost certainly would have made it down the mountain safely if he had stopped and rested a little bit and then continued on. Unfortunately, you're about to find out that that is not at all what would end up happening. The Uzbekistan climbers continued up the mountain, and after they traversed the first step, they found Fran in dire condition. She was reportedly on her feet, but like slumped over on a rock, kind of fading in and out of consciousness, and without her harness on for some reason. It's really impossible to confirm any of this stuff, but the climbers alleged that they spent an hour trying to assist Fran, giving her oxygen and various medicine, before 3 of the 5 ended up continuing on towards the summit. At this point, Fran was obviously suffering from altitude sickness, and she was also becoming extremely frostbitten. The 2 other climbers remained with Fran for another hour or 2 before finally setting off themselves as well. But before they left, they reattached Fran to the fixed rope, and they also left her with an oxygen mask on her face. All these climbers would go on to reach the summit, and when they climbed back down to Fran's position, these men reportedly stopped once again to try and help her, but at this point they were running really low on oxygen themselves and becoming extremely fatigued. They weren't really in the best condition to try and rescue Fran, but 2 of them did actually attempt this. They tried to like lower her down the mountain, but they weren't really able to move her very far, and eventually they stopped, fearing that if they continued with this rescue, they would end up putting themselves in a life or death situation, much like Fran was in at the moment. And thus, they gave Fran yet another bottle of oxygen, they fixed her to the rope, and then they left her, and they headed back down to camp. The first of these Uzbekistan climbers to arrive back at Camp 6 alerted Sergei of his wife's location and her dire condition, which reportedly sent him into a frenzy. I mean, this must have been just brutal news for him to hear. He reportedly actually started climbing immediately back up the mountain by himself, but he didn't make it very far before some of the other climbers there convinced him to at least take some bottled oxygen and some medicine with him. And so he briefly returned, he grabbed these items, and then he set off back up the mountain all by himself in order to try to save his wife. At this point, Sergei had spent days and days in the death zone with no supplemental oxygen. Again, he was completely exhausted, and being an experienced and competent climber, he would have known that his rescue attempt would very likely cost him his own life. At the same time, he also would have known that nobody else was going to risk their own lives in order to save Fran. He knew that she was on the verge of death, probably too far gone at that point, but regardless of this, he still set out anyway, risking his life. I mean, he didn't even hesitate. It was nothing short of, I mean, I'm going to call it a heroic move. So at this point, the climbers from Uzbekistan had kind of like broken up into different groups. Some of them had already reached camp and talked to Sergei, but some of them were still coming down the mountain. And so as Sergei was climbing up, he actually intersected some of these last climbers. They had a brief exchange with him, and they told him that his wife was still alive, and that was pretty much it. They parted ways. And unfortunately, after this encounter was over, Sergei Arsentiev was never seen alive ever again. The next morning, Kathy O'Dowd and a few other members from her team, and also another team from a different team from Uzbekistan, they all found Fran still laying there fixed to the rope with barely any life left in her. O'Dowd actually assumed that she was dead until she saw Fran's body twitch. And so when this happened, she went over to Fran, and she unknowingly became the captive audience for Fran's last words on Earth. Fran reportedly said, quote, "Don't leave me, don't leave me." As an experienced mountaineer, O'Dowd knew that doing exactly that, leaving Fran there, was definitely a possible outcome, because it was looking like she was probably too far gone to save. Kathy O'Dowd told Fran that she needed to go get a few more members from her team, to which Fran said, quote, "Why are you doing this to me?" The group of climbers all began to try and help Fran. They gave her oxygen. They tried putting her warmer clothes back on her, some of which she had apparently taken off. It's a very common thing that people with advanced stages of hypothermia will do. They'll get this weird warm sensation all of a sudden and take off their clothing. So they did all this to try to help her before they actually tried to pick her up and carry her down the mountain. This proved to be far too exhausting and impossible for the climbers because they were also realizing that they were burning a lot of their own oxygen trying to help Fran, and they were getting low on oxygen. Fran then suddenly proclaimed, quote, "I am American. I am American." Now, up to this point, O'Dowd and the rest of her team didn't know who this woman was. They didn't know her identity. But after Fran said that she was American, O'Dowd actually realized who the woman probably was. I guess her and Fran had actually interacted a little bit back down at base camp. And because of this, O'Dowd also knew that Fran and Sergei were climbing together as a team, which was disturbing because, well, he was nowhere to be found. The climbers all did their best, but ultimately there was really nothing that could have been done to save Francys Arsentiev. And thus, tragically, she died. She died right there and then. And soon after that, O'Dowd and her teammates called off their summit attempt. They began descending, and as they did, there was a lot going through O'Dowd's head. I mean, she was wondering about how Fran had ended up in such a dire situation. And of course, again, she wondered what the hell had happened to her husband. Before the climbers left Fran, they allegedly discovered Sergei's ice axe and his rope laying only a short distance away from her. Again, this is one of the things that I'm not 100% on. There was some conflicting reports about it, but it seems likely that this did happen, and I sure hope it did, because if that's true, that means that Fran and Sergei at least got to spend a few more moments together before they both died. The fate of Sergei Arsentiev remained a mystery for the rest of the year 1998. And then the following year, an expedition was sent out to search for the bodies of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, who had disappeared in 1924 while attempting to climb Mount Everest for the first time in history. This was a very famous expedition, and they actually would end up recovering George Mallory's body on it. And they also accidentally discovered the body of Sergei Arsentiev as well. I mean, we'll never know exactly what happened, unfortunately, but with the discovery of his body, we are able to kind of generally piece together what might have happened. And so here's that theory. It appears as though Sergei, who was desperate to save his wife, fell and died while in the process of trying to move her down the mountain. Once again, when Sergei first heard about his wife's condition, he could have stayed at Camp 6 and then safely descended the mountain the next day. He definitely had enough energy. He was still healthy at this time. And if he had done that, I mean, he would almost certainly still be alive today, but that's not what he did. He was willing to risk his life to save his wife, and unfortunately, he paid the ultimate price for it. So, now I have a somewhat controversial question for all of you. First of all, thank you for watching this far into the video, and if you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel and help us get to 1 million subscribers. We have a long ways to go, so please do that. Anyways, Fran and Sergei died doing what they loved, but my question is, do you think that it was worth it? Obviously, mountaineering is very dangerous. So how much risk is acceptable before it just becomes like a death wish? It's a tough question because tons of people climb Mount Everest and they're completely fine, but a lot of people die while trying to climb it as well. And I'm not trying to suggest that people shouldn't be allowed to climb it or anything like that, but I don't know, dude, this story just has me thinking about what regrets, if any, Fran and Sergei would have had running through their heads in their final moments. My heart goes out to them. May they rest in peace. And folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, YouTube seems to think that this video right here is the next one that you're going to enjoy. So go ahead and click that. And of course, thank you all so much for watching.